Welcome, listeners. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons if you enjoy my content. And let me know in the comments if you have a story you want me to read. I'm going to begin this with just a little preface about me. I've been a nurse for about 6 years, with the last 2 years being spent in an ICU at my local hospital. I'm a 28-year-old woman who is barely 5 feet tall and weighing close to 110 pounds. Even with my small stature, I've never been the type of person to fear the unknown. I've always been a strong believer in science and that there is a logical explanation for most odd events. Though raised Catholic, I truly don't believe in any religion, more agnostic than atheist, but that's not the point. Basically, I'm saying that I do not believe in the supernatural or spooky monsters. That is until the last 5 months. I cannot explain what's going on with me. I'm either experiencing a mental breakdown or there is something unnatural in this world that I never thought possible. Let me start from the beginning. I had just clocked in at 7:01 a.m. on my 18-bed unit. It was my last work day of the week, but also my on-call, meaning I had to stay an extra 4 hours after my regular 12-hour shift. We were surprisingly not full, and less than half the beds were occupied with patients. This was not long after that most recent wave of COVID, when we were so packed that we had to open up another ICU to hold our vented and critical patients, and constantly had overflow waiting in the ER. So coming into work with only 8 patients and 5 nurses on schedule felt too good to be true. I was only assigned 1 patient at the time, but was open for the first admission. My morning went by pretty slow and uneventful as I cared for my 1 patient and helped out coworkers with the basics. Around 11 a.m., my charge informed me I was getting the new ER admission. Great. I took the name and medical record number from her and began looking them up on my computer. Gary Nelson, 31-year-old male. Main diagnosis, ETOH withdrawal. Ugh, I hate alcohol withdrawal patients, I thought as I continued to read the chart. His vitals looked stable and I could see that they started him on a Precedex drip in the ER, which is why he has to come to the ICU. I go to the notes and find the admitting physician's note. What I read surprised me a little. 31-year-old male with no significant past medical history. Presenting in ED for hallucinations and seizures, most likely due to ETOH withdrawal. Patient is a poor historian, refusing to answer many questions. Upon examination, appears malnourished but all systems intact. Accompanied by 2 officers of SPD, currently in police custody. I read the remainder of the note, which just reviewed all labs and medications that have been given. I couldn't find anything else on why this man was in police custody. I guess it was not pertinent to delivering medical care, but in my 6 years as a nurse, I have never actually dealt with this situation. It is a decent-sized suburb I live in, but my hospital isn't the biggest in the area, or even the closest to the police station. So it was odd that we would get someone in custody. I was curious about what the person had done, but honestly was expecting a DUI or some type of petty crime. I jot down some information on the patient and just continue going about my day, waiting for him to come up to the unit. Around 11:45, I see Erica pushing a stretcher down our hall. Now, Erica is a veteran ER nurse, like 20-plus years working in level 1 trauma hospitals and very underfunded hospitals in the bad parts of the city, before coming to this hospital, meaning she has seen some shit and knows how to handle herself with crazy, dangerous patients. So when I see her face looking a little paler and walking faster than usual, I can feel little buds of anxiety starting to blossom in my head. On either side of Erica are 2 rather large policemen with stern faces, eyes surveying the unit. I look into the stretcher expecting some big guy covered in tattoos and wearing leather or something. I guess the stereotypical criminal pops into mind. What I see instead is this average-looking man, well, almost average. He looked very disheveled. His brown short hair was sticking up at random angles, almost appearing matted on the side. His eyes looked sunken in his head, with large dark puffy bags underneath. He was staring down at his lap, or maybe it was at his hands, which were both restrained to the side rails. Now these weren't the usual restraints we use. They were the violent restraints, that were rarely used except for patients who were a threat to themselves and the staff. He did indeed look rather malnourished, with the regular-sized gown drowning on his thin frame. When they arrived to his room, the police undid the restraints from the rails and put handcuffs on his wrists in front of his body. As we slid him onto the ICU bed, the officers were standing like they were ready for him to jump up and attack. Luckily, he did nothing, just laid down and kept staring towards his feet. They then took off the handcuffs and put the restraints back onto his new bed. One of the officers stayed in the room and the other one stood outside the door. When Erica and I walked out the door so she could give me a report on this patient, the officer outside spoke to me. "Do not go into this room unless you see me or my partner there. One of us will always be in the room. Got it?" I was in some state of shock, thinking, how bad could this guy be? I just nodded at the officer and walked to the counter. As soon as I saw Erica, I just started asking questions. "Dude, what the hell? Who is this guy? Did he kill someone? Is he actually dangerous? Like, am I gonna get hurt?" I was whispering to her with my back to the room and the officer. "I don't know. He's barely talked, and when he does, it's just creepy. I can't really explain it. He just gives me such a bad vibe." I overheard Giant 1 and Giant 2 over there talking when they first brought him in. "Have you read about those recent murders in the area?" Erica took a deep breath as she handed me his paper chart. Sorta. I think I heard about some girl found near the river a month or so ago. Honestly, I don't watch the news often. Was that him?" I was trying to rack my brain on any details I remember my fiancé telling me a while ago about that case. I only remembered that she was young, in high school, I think. She was found after missing for 3 days under the bridge near the river. Apparently, they think he's the one that killed her and 4 others. That's not even the worst part. He was found with his last 2 victims a few nights ago, and they were his wife and 4-year-old son. She eyed the room and the police officer as we kept whispering back and forth. The officer gave her a strange look and she stood up a little taller. "Okay, well, let me give you a report on this guy." She didn't go much more into what she overheard, but just stated the facts that she knew. He was arrested 2 days ago, apparently very drunk. He was being kept in holding when, early this morning, he began having vivid visual and auditory hallucinations, and experiencing seizures, according to the officers who brought him in. She told me all the information I needed to know to provide him with care. She ended the report with one last look back at the door, and almost more to herself than me, she said, "Just be careful, okay? I've dealt with criminals before, but something is off with this guy. I don't know what, but just have a bad feeling. Always know where the door is and never let him be between you and the door. If you feel like something is going to happen, just leave." She looks back at me and forces a laugh. "Sorry, I'm probably being overdramatic. You'll be okay." She grabbed her stretcher and monitor and left the unit quickly. My charge nurse, a couple coworkers, and myself go into his room and start doing what we do every ICU admission. We are wiping his body with CHG wipes, changing the gown and putting our monitoring devices on him. It was a little complicated since the officers would not let us remove the restraints in order to turn him fully, but we did what we could. During this cleaning, we noticed that he was not only covered in dirt, but also what appeared to be blood. He had small splatters everywhere on him. His arms, chest, back. His hair was in fact matted on one side with blood. The officers gave us permission to wipe him down as they have already collected enough evidence and photos. When we were all done, we were surprised not to find any cuts or abrasions on him, thus proving further that this was not his own blood in my mind. Throughout this whole process, Gary did not say a single word. He would follow our commands when asking to turn or move his body, but never said anything to the questions we were asking. When we were done, my coworkers all left the room. Only Gary, the officer, and myself were left. The anxiety I had felt earlier was so much worse now. I had to actively remember to breathe and make myself stop shaking. I should also mention I can be pretty awkward in uncomfortable situations. My mind often goes blank in these situations, so I end up usually saying the first thing that comes to mind, which is almost always something awkward. And this, my friends, was a very uncomfortable situation. So, Gary, as I said before, my name's Gwen, and I'm going to be your nurse today. Since you just came into the hospital, I have to go through some boring admission questions with you. No response. I looked to the officer, then back at Gary. Well, at least you're not in jail right now. I mean, like, you're arrested, but not physically in jail. you're in a hospital. And, um, it's nicer, I guess. Like, at least there's no metal bars on the door. Still have the scary cop watching you, though. So, yeah. I was wincing at everything I said as I stared at the computer. I glanced quickly behind me at the officer, who was just staring at me like I was crazy. Then I peeked at Gary, who surprisingly had a faint smile on his face. The beds are comfier here than in jail, Gary whispered. Oh, cool. Anyway, can I ask you some questions? I quickly changed the subject. My awkwardness somehow warmed him up to talking to me. A little bit of my anxiety ebbed the more we talked. He answered almost all of my questions regarding his health history and any medications he's been taking. On paper, this was a healthy, normal 31-year-old. No mental health issues, physical issues. He had a stable job and good family life prior to 4 months ago. When I asked what happened 4 months ago that changed everything, he became quiet again. I figured he was not going to tell me, and I began to get ready to leave the room. And then he started talking. According to him, everything changed when he witnessed a stranger kill himself. He said he was riding the train back home after working late one night. There were not many people in the car, and he was one of the last stops. When there was just one more stop to go, only him and a young guy were left on the train. They were sitting across the aisle from each other, and Gary hadn't paid him much attention until then, when he started noticing the guy was staring at him. He asked the guy what he wanted, and the guy said to just be able to sleep for once. Gary said this guy looked sickly, wearing baggy clothes, had sunken eyes, greasy hair, and skin so thin it looked translucent. He initially was just going to ignore the man, but then the man got up and sat directly in front of him. Gary said he felt nervous and wanted to leave, but he couldn't for some reason. The man just sat quietly, staring at Gary. As the train began to slow, coming up to Gary's stop, the man pulled out a gun. Gary was frozen and still couldn't move. The man said, "I'm sorry, but I can't live like this anymore. Please forgive me. I need sleep." Then shot himself in the head, splattering Gary with the bloody aftermath. As Gary was telling me this story, he had a grief-stricken look in his eyes, tears slowly running down his face. I looked at the officer, who was scribbling rapidly into his notepad. When I left the room, I was actually feeling bad for Gary. The anxiety I had earlier was almost gone. He seemed rather nice, and to have something so horrible happen in front of him, no one deserves to see that. I had almost forgotten what Erica had said about him murdering his family. Allegedly, that is. I continued on with my day, doing my hourly checks on my patients. Each time I went into Gary's room, he would engage in conversation with me. He was always friendly and was actually a pretty good patient. Since he was there for alcohol withdrawal, I had to keep assessing his CIWA score to see if he needed medications to prevent withdrawal symptoms. He kept scoring high, stating he kept seeing people who were not there and hearing them talk and touch him. His hands were visibly shaking every time I went in the room, yet he seemed cheered up whenever I would enter. He said when I came in, the people would leave until I left. I had given him multiple high doses of Ativan throughout my shift, but it did not seem to be working. He was already maxed out on the sedation drip, so we just kept giving him more and more medications. A normal person would probably be knocked out from the amount of benzos we were pushing, but not Gary. He looked absolutely exhausted, but he would not close his eyes long enough to sleep. When I mentioned it, he just stared at me and said, "I cannot sleep. If I sleep, then I will not be me. I can't let that happen." I knew if we kept giving him the meds, he would not be able to resist sleeping. The drug would take over and nothing he could do would stop it. Around 6 p.m., I walk into his room and I see he's sleeping. I feel almost happy for him that he is finally resting. I go into the room to change out the IV bag that's almost empty. I'm being extra careful not to make a lot of noise because I don't want him to wake up. The IV pole is on the other side of the bed, meaning I have to walk past the bed and him to get to it. At this time, the officers were also at shift change, so as I'm switching out my old bag for the new bag, the two officers were huddled together with the two that have been there all day in the front of the door. They were not technically out of the room, but they did not have a clear view of me or Gary the way they were standing. I didn't notice this at first, since I was focused on my medication. I turned my head slightly to look at the sleeping patient, but what I saw made me freeze. Gary was almost crouching in the bed with both hands on the railing closest to me, leaning towards me. His face had a wide, almost unnatural grin, like he was clenching his jaw so hard it was about to break and the skin was being forced to widen as far as possible. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated so much you could barely see any color of his iris, making them look like black holes sucking you into their depth. It felt like the room was on fire. I could feel sweat dripping off my back and down my legs, yet I felt cold inside, like something was trying to steal something precious that was deep in me. My head felt heavy and I felt like the room was spinning as Gary got closer and closer to me. I couldn't make a noise or move an inch. Time seemed to be moving so slow. All I could think was, how did he get out of his restraints? Where is the cop? I'm going to die. Suddenly, I heard footsteps approaching. My eyes shifted from this horror in front of me to the door. The cop stopped right when he saw me, then looked to the bed, then continued towards the chair that was occupied by the previous cop. I wanted to scream at him to do something, but when I looked to the bed, I saw Gary laying down, sleeping as he had been when I first entered, in his restraints, as if nothing had happened. I practically ran out of the room straight to the bathroom and started sobbing. What had just happened? I had to have imagined that. There was no way he could have gotten out of those restraints, and if he did, he would not have been able to get back into them in a blink of an eye. I convinced myself it was all in my head and I was just tired, having worked the past 2 days. I wanted to avoid his room, but I knew as his nurse, I was responsible for providing care. I was just going to be more cautious when I entered again. I didn't tell anyone about what I thought I saw, because I had to believe it wasn't real. The next time I entered, Gary was awake. He looked at me as if nothing happened, but I could sense something was off. I was asking him the usual questions about having hallucinations, being anxious, headache, etc. When I looked down and saw his right hand was out of the restraint, I slowly started backing towards the door and was about to yell at the officer when Gary looked me in the eyes. His eyes were more normal, but looked deeply sad, like he was watching something horrid unfolding in front of him. I'm not sure if he was really looking at me or at something else. Tears were running down his face. He whispered something I couldn't hear. It felt like something was pulling me closer to him. I was now an arm's length away from him. I saw something shiny like steel in his unrestrained hand. He looked down and then back in my eyes and said, "I'm so sorry. I never meant to do it. Please forgive me. I need sleep." Quicker than I thought possible, he raised his hand and ran it across his throat. I was splashed with red-hot sticky blood. In his hand lay a scalpel. As if this was all in slow motion up until he slit his throat, everything after was sped up. I remember screaming and trying to apply pressure to his neck as the police officer grabbed me and took me out of the room. I remember sitting in room after room being asked the same questions over and over again. How did he get a scalpel? How did he get out of his restraints? What did he tell you? What did you do? I did not have any of the answers. Fast forward to now, 5 months after Gary's death, I keep waking up in strange areas that I don't remember going to sleep in. I've had people say they have seen me at night, but I ignore them when they try to get my attention. I feel like I haven't slept since that day at the hospital, even though I know I fall asleep every night. And today, I find myself covered in blood. But I have no wounds on me anywhere. This isn't my blood. I don't know who I am when I fall asleep.